so these are notes on ATP production. So in the cellular respiration notes, we kept talking about how we would stop at this point if you were on this level, but you guys are, since this is a 10th grade course, we're going to go a little deeper. And that going a little deeper is talking about this molecule called ATP. And more information can be found on pages 359 to 363 of your text. So we know all about breaking down the glucose now in cellular respiration. So now we want to look at sort of this glucose to ATP link. So breaking down glucose, and when I say breaking down glucose, I don't mean physically breaking the glucose apart. I mean the whole reaction in general is exothermic. When we break down glucose, it takes very little energy to break it down. The products that form are very stable, so the overall thing is exothermic. That energy from that reaction is used to power a reaction that makes another molecule called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And ATP, the making of ATP, that's an endothermic reaction. So we need ATP for us to get usable energy. But to make ATP, it's very endothermic. Where do we get that energy from? We get it from the previous reactions. So in other words, we use energy to get energy, which is normal, right? Like when we burned the ethanol, now you can get spontaneous combustion, but we added a little energy, right? I had the fire starter, so we added a little energy, but then we got out so much more energy than we put in because that overall reaction was very exothermic. Okay, so now we have our ATP. Making our ATP was endothermic. The energy in order to have that reaction comes from the breaking down of the glucose reaction. When the ATP reacts, it's exothermic, and that energy from that reaction is what we use to power cellular function. However, one thing I want to say is all of this is happening at once. It's not like step by step. And so we're going to kind of dig into what that looks like. But remember earlier I said in cellular respiration that overall it was exothermic, but it was a bunch of different things going on, and some were endothermic and some were exothermic. So now we're kind of unpacking that. And if you're confused at this point, that's okay. Hopefully by the time we get to the end, I'll have pictures and stuff and it will be less confusing. So just hold your horses and relax if you're a little confused now. So first of all, this is adenosine triphosphate. So it's made of 3 components, I would say. Oh, here's my mouse. Let me get a pen. So this here is adenine, and adenine is actually one of the bases in DNA. Some of you have maybe heard of it. And then it's connected to a ribose here. And that also is part of DNA, so you've heard of deoxyribo, okay? That's where the ribo comes from, nucleic acid. And then tri means 3, so 3 phosphates. So here are my 3 phosphate groups. So here's 1 phosphate, here's a 2nd phosphate, and here's my 3rd phosphate group. Okay, so it's adenosine triphosphate. All right, so let's look at what's happening. So we also have something called ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2. So here we have ADP plus a phosphate group, okay? Now we need ATP in order to get usable energy. Why our bodies evolved that way, who knows? But that's the way it works. It's like saying, why do cars use gasoline instead of sandwiches? Well, cars didn't evolve that way. That's how we made them. But we evolved this way. We can't just get energy from anything, and it's not necessarily good isn't the word, but we want to get a lot of energy, right? We need a lot of energy to run all of our bodily functions. So we need to get some ATP. So we have this ADP and we have phosphate. And in order to get ATP, we need to somehow react these so that we get our third phosphate, so that these two things connect. So we need energy to do that. So we have an input of chemical energy. That's that whole breaking down of the glucose stuff that we talked about earlier. And so those two things go together and we get ATP. And ATP has lots and lots of stored energy. So when it reacts, and it reacts by getting rid of that third phosphate, it releases a lot of energy. Now, some of you are going, but I thought when you formed molecules it released, and when you broke apart molecules it absorbed energy, you needed energy. And that's absolutely right. But there's other reactions going on in here. It's not just the ATP reacting with the phosphate or the phosphate breaking away from the ATP. There's all these different reactions with water molecules and all sorts of things going on. This is making it a little easier. So then, as that breaks back down into ADP plus P, we get an energy output, and that's the energy we can use. So this is the way the whole thing looks. So this process here, okay, we'll say that process there is endothermic, and then this process here, going back down that way, is exothermic. And for us to have energy that we need to do anything that we do, we need to break down ATP. So that is another molecule that we have in addition to this carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, and glucose. All right, so let's look at what's happening. This is what we know so far. So this here is a mitochondria. Some of you probably know that already from working on your organelle projects. And what we knew from the last video was that sugars and oxygen form carbon dioxide and water, and that we get a lot of energy out. And now we can add in, we also get a lot of ATP out of this process, okay? So let's now go into it in a little more depth. All right, so this is more depth. So this is a mitochondrion, which is the singular of mitochondria. And don't stress yet about all of this stuff, okay? There's three main parts that I want you to know. And that's here. This is number 1, glycolysis. This is number 2, the Krebs cycle. And this is number 3, the electron transport chain, okay? And there's a couple of things I want you to notice. The first thing is that ATP is produced at every stage in the game, at glycolysis, at the Krebs cycle, and at the electron transport chain. So remember how we said breaking down of that glucose helps get us the energy we need to continue to get more energy? That's because in glycolysis we actually produce some ATP, and that ATP is then used, right? We need ATP to get usable energy. That ATP is used to continue the entire process. The other thing I want you to notice is that while generally we say that cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria, the glycolysis step actually happens outside the mitochondria, okay, in what's called the cytosol, or just kind of part of the cell. And then it's the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain that happen inside the mitochondria. The third thing I want you to be aware of is that while we're highlighting this as 3 steps, each of these steps, glycolysis, Krebs, and electron transport, actually have numerous steps within them and molecules that we're not even going to talk about. So there's stuff called NADH and NADP and NAD+. Don't write those down. Don't worry about them. If you really want more information, Crash Course, their cellular respiration, I think it's called cellular respiration, but it's under Crash Course. They go into a lot more depth about this if you want more depth. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. So the first thing that happens is the glucose is broken down. So here's our glucose in a process called glycolysis, okay? And that process forms 2 ATP molecules after the whole shebang is done. Incidentally, when those of you who are athletes and you talk about lactic acid buildup in your muscles, so lactic acid buildup happens when your muscles are working too hard to go through this entire process, so you just start harvesting the ATP from glycolysis. And that's an anaerobic process, so anaerobic meaning without oxygen, that the products of that process are lactic acid, and other stuff as well. But lactic acid is one of those things. So those of you who've heard that and you know about aerobic versus anaerobic exercise, the anaerobic is essentially just taking the ATP from the glycolysis. In oxygen-happy environments, so the reason in like sprinting, for example, you go into the ATP from glycolysis is because your body cannot physically get oxygen to all of your cells in order to continue this whole cycle. In oxygen-happy environments, when your body is happily circulating oxygen to all of your cells, the products of glycolysis, and it's actually, so if you remember, glucose is a 6-carbon ring. The products are 2 3-carbon chains. You don't have to remember that. And then those products go into the Krebs cycle. So here it is a cycle. There's a bunch of different reactions happening. Don't worry about what those are. But there's 2 things I want you to know. One is within the Krebs cycle, it produces, again, 2 ATP. So you're still getting some ATP. Plus, that is where the carbon dioxide comes out, okay? So, remember, we know that carbon dioxide is one of our products. Then, in the electron transport chain, that is where the oxygen comes in. So if you remember back to cellular respiration, I said that glucose doesn't actually react with the oxygen. The oxygen doesn't come in until much later. And you can still get your energy without it. It's just that anaerobic exercise. And you don't get as much energy. That's why you tire so much faster. So that oxygen comes in the electron transport chain. This is also where you get water as one of your products. So now you see all of your reactants in your products that we know of. And here you get anywhere from like 30 to 32 ATP, okay? So total, if everything is working as efficiently as it can, you get somewhere between 34 and 36 ATP. So that would be 30 plus 2 is 34, but sometimes this could, at maximum efficiency be even up to 32. So it's really that electron transport chain that's giving us the bulk of our ATP. And that ATP is the molecule that we can then break down into ADP, which is wildly exothermic, which gives us the energy we need to function. And then once ATP is made in the mitochondria, it's transported to other parts of the cell, but not other cells. So remember, going all the way back to cellular respiration, we don't store energy. We don't store ATP. We make ATP and we use ATP. We make ATP and we use ATP. If we want to store something, we can store the glucose either for long-term storage as glycogen or short-term storage as glucose. But what we use in the cell, what we make in the cell, we use in the cell, and we use it pretty instantaneously. Okay? All right. So here's now a little more overview. If you want to start to add in some of those arrows, it's really the glucose and the oxygen with the ADP and the P that forms our carbon dioxide, our water, and our ATP. And then we can break down that ATP through a series of reactions, which end up being very exothermic, which gives us our energy to live. And I think that's it. Yeah, there we go. Whoops. Anyway, if you have questions, feel free to ask them. There we go. And we'll stop.